This intensity may actually keep a person with a disorganized attachment style hooked. It becomes a confirmation, sadly, that relationships are unsafe and untrustworthy, and that confirmation can keep a person locked into a toxic cycle. Let's talk attachment styles. More and more people are exploring their attachment styles, and these attachment styles, which develop in childhood, can have implications for adult relationships. And your attachment style has bearing on how things may unfold, in particular in a narcissistic relationship. In this series, we will be taking on the 4 attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure, and talk about how these may show up in a narcissistic relationship. Now remember, this stuff about attachment styles, it's not a horoscope, right? You aren't stuck forever being an ambitious Capricorn. Healthy connections as your life goes on can shape your way of being in the world and your attachment. Research has also shown that our mental health in a present moment is a stronger predictor than other factors, such as childhood attachment style, for determining certain aspects of relationship health. Basically, how you're doing now is more important than the stuff that might have happened in the past. And even within a family, you may have a very secure attachment with one parent and an insecure attachment style with another. One of those attachment styles may predominate, especially if that secure attachment was with the more present parent, and you still may go on to secure attachments in adulthood. None of this is dooming you, okay? But let's start at the top with the anxious attachment style. People with anxious attachment styles are folks that can feel insecure and pretty much on their back foot in close relationships. There is an asymmetry when an anxiously attached person enters any relationship, but definitely in a narcissistic relationship, because the anxiously attached person will devalue or undervalue themselves and overvalue the narcissistic person. And since the narcissistic person is already devaluing the anxiously attached person, that's a lot of devaluing for that person. In relationships, people who are anxiously attached often seek a lot of reassurance. They wait for the approval and for the validation of the other person. Again, this is a terrible position to be in a narcissistic relationship, since that validation faucet is only running one way and it isn't towards you. And because anxiously attached people often do need reassurance to feel not only safe, but to stave off that fear of abandonment, narcissistic relationships can be brutal for people with this attachment style. This need for reassurance may extend, for example, to seeking out reassurance when you are separated from them. Like, for example, one of you is going on a trip and one of you is not. And first of all, let's face it, narcissistic people tend to have a propensity for poor boundaries and may be shady, especially when they're away. So all of this, just the very act of separation and the shadiness on top of that, can make separations and distance really difficult for anxiously attached people who not only find separations to be devastating, then they really, really, really miss the person. Now here is where it gets even more difficult. Many narcissistic people, especially vulnerable narcissistic people, also have anxiously attached styles. So that means that the vulnerable narcissistic person may be grappling for reassurance and approval and validation, but have little to offer and return. And the valuation dynamic will get overpowered. The narcissism may overpower the attachment style, and what we may see is that the vulnerable, anxiously attached narcissistic person is sort of feeling like a victim, but also undervaluing the other person, but also living in fear of being abandoned by the other person. So you can see how these relationships can get so twisted and contentious. Anxiously attached styles are come out of a combination of high anxiety but low avoidance. This is an attachment style that's also called the preoccupied attachment style, meaning that there's anxiety and fear around attachment and separation and lots of rumination about these relationships. The anxiously attached person is often thinking about the other person in the relationship when they're not with them. And yet, Anxiously attached people do rather regularly find themselves in relationships with narcissistic people. Who knows, maybe because these relationships resembled at least one early childhood relationship in which attachment needs were, or attachment seeking was insecure at best. Now, anxious attachments, again, come out of early relationships characterized by inconsistency, caregiver unavailability, just sort of caregivers that are in and out. Parents that create anxious attachments create environments that are actually quite similar to narcissistic relationships, attuned at some times, misattuned at many others, and the child is left anxious and not safe in the assurance that they can beckon and call forth the caregiver when they need them. And the other narcissistic vibe that creates these anxious attachments is that parents that foster anxious attachments are those who look to the child for their own needs, for the parent's need to be validated. These are parents who may be intrusive and in terms of have really lousy boundaries, and the child simply becomes a source of narcissistic supply. These parents may overparent when they believe it's going to get them the validation or the result that they want. It's not unusual for anxiously attached children to come from families where the children are only interesting when they make the parents look good. And in this way, we can see how the intergenerational cycles of narcissistic parenting can foster anxious attachments that may create all kinds of relationship challenges for the next generation. The devaluation that anxiously attached people sort of push towards themselves is what makes this style most treacherous in narcissistic relationships, because people with this style are already so self-disparaging that when the narcissistic person participates in the devaluation, the anxiously attached person may become reinforced in the sense that it is true, and the fears of separation and abandonment may mean that the person will fall into deeply entrenched trauma-bonded cycles of justification and rationalization and self-blame. This group of anxiously attached folks suffer quite a bit in narcissistic relationships. And for anxiously attached folks, having consistent, loving, and accessible supports in adulthood is crucial. Basically, the opposite of a narcissistic relationship. So for those of you out there who have taken the tests and found out that you have an anxious attachment style and you've had a narcissistic relationship, you know it was a wild ride and frankly a very unhealthy one. This is a particularly bad style in terms of the harm it brings to the person, the anxiously attached person in these relationships, because the very dynamics are all being constantly played on, creating greater and greater sense of fear and anxiety in these relationships. We're going to talk about the avoidant attachment style. This is an attachment style that has also been called the dismissive style. We can call it the avoidant/dismissive style. These are sort of those psychological solo travelers, very independent, and they can actually be quite emotionally cut off too. They don't ask for much emotionally, and in turn, they don't offer much emotionally. And when they are faced up with emotion in a relationship, a partner, for example, showing emotion to them, their tendency is to pull away. The avoidant/dismissive attached folks, these are folks who will not come to a relationship with deep intimacy needs or emotional needs, and like I said, in parallel to that, will not have much to offer to any show of emotion. In fact, are quite put off by it. Because they're so independent and somewhat emotionally detached, it can kind of appear as though they simply do not need relationships, and things like abandonment stuff is really not an issue for them. They're the kind of folks who aren't going to miss you when you're away from them and you're in a relationship with them. And honestly, if there was ever a style that I think could work well in a narcissistic relationship, it might be this one. Now, don't get me wrong, there can still be lots of fireworks. Because interestingly, narcissistic people do not do well with abandonment. So if a person with this attachment style can't be bothered and then steps back, it can result in volatility within a relationship with a narcissistic person. But the tendency of the avoidant, dismissive person to not expect emotional needs to be a thing in a relationship, and that sort of fierce independence in terms of relationships. It's almost a built-in hedge against the narcissistic distance that shows up in relationships. However, if the narcissistic person was reaching in and wanting more, the avoidant person may pull away and step away, and then a pretty toxic approach and avoidance stance may get initiated in the relationship. Not surprisingly, while the vulnerable narcissistic folks may be, as we already talked about, in that more anxious attached space, the grandiose and malignant narcissists may very well have more of this avoidant attachment style. So you can imagine, let's take it one way, if an avoidant and dismissive narcissist and then an anxiously attached person got into a relationship, how that can become very messy and very cruel very quickly. The contempt and dismissiveness you might see from the avoidant narcissistic person for emotion, for the needs of the other person, and that fierce emotional independence. Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm sure you're hearing this and saying, well, that sounds like a narcissist. But the fact is that not all people with dismissive, avoidant attachments are narcissistic. It's not the case at all. Now, you may wonder what kind of parenting style leads to the dismissive avoidant attachment style. It tends to originate with parents who are sort of cold and detached from the child's emotional states. They may very well pull away when the child is asking for nurturance or reassurance or closeness. The caregivers do not necessarily neglect the child in general. They're actually probably physically present. And that might even feel a little worse. And sadly, the more the child reaches in to the child for needs and wants and emotion, the more that the caregiver is likely to withdraw. And these avoidant parents also likely don't show much emotion either. It isn't that sort of in and out quality with the anxious parent, but rather the physically present, emotionally absent parent. That's what leads to the avoidant sort of attachment style. These are parents who shut down any shows of emotion and may label them as weak or excessive or unnecessary in their child. Now, people may get to an avoidant attachment style because their emotional needs were once not met, and they are not willing to take the bet that they will be met, so closing up and cutting out of the emotional element of a relationship sort of feels safer. This is a style, the avoidant/dismissive style is characterized by low anxiety and high avoidance. The separation and abandonment anxiety we might see, for example, in someone who's anxiously attached is not present. And in the face of emotion, these people will retreat if they have this avoidant attachment style. If anything, with this attachment style, with this avoidant attachment style, these are the folks that may walk away from a narcissistic relationship because they may very well find that the neediness, the fragility, and the reassurance seeking, especially of a vulnerable narcissist, may be too much. And again, this avoidant attachment style in a narcissistic relationship can be tricky. Because one thing we do know about narcissistic people is that they can be very rejection sensitive. And because of that rejection sensitivity, that if they get into a relationship with someone who's more avoidant, who simply just does not like what's being asked of in the relationship or just simply wants to do their own thing, it'll be a lot easier for that avoidant person to detach, which for that rejection-sensitive narcissistic person who also needs to stay in control can really froth up a tremendous amount of volatility. So there are all kinds of attachment tests out there on the internet. There's different ones. I know there's some that I particularly like. We could drop those in the video notes. And I think that the websites that out there, some of them are actually quite good, run by academics who know a lot about this. But the fact of the matter is that understanding your attachment style can also give you a bit of a roadmap for some of the unique kind of potholes that you will fall into in the road called a narcissistic relationship. Now, this is a very difficult style to bring into a narcissistic relationship. It's a style characterized by high avoidance and high anxiety, both. This is the attachment style where we see both the avoidant and anxious attachment styles come together. It's an attachment style where we see lots of difficulties and challenges with trust in any relationship. And so there might be, for people with disorganized attachment styles in their relationships, there might be intense periods of closeness, and then the person with the disorganized relationship style will pull away when things feel uncomfortable, and then intensely recouple, perhaps if there is a period of hoovering or coming together. As a result, this means that when a person with a disorganized, fearful attachment style is in a relationship with a narcissistic person, it can be very volatile. The very nature of narcissistic relationships, where there is idealization mixed with invalidation, sometimes mixed with detachment, can mean that that kind of relationship landscape for a person with a disorganized, fearful attachment style can feel like terror and chaos. Dysregulation is a common theme in people with disorganized/fearful attachment styles, and it can be difficult for people with these attachment styles to manage their emotions, which means there can be strong shows of anger, despair, depression. In any relationship, this kind of emotional dysregulation will be confusing and chaotic at times. But in a narcissistic relationship, the emotional dysregulation will come up against the dysregulation that we see in narcissistic people, right? So you got it on both sides. And this is really problematic, especially when the narcissistic person is rageful or angry. And as you can imagine, people with disorganized/fearful attachment styles may also struggle with abandonment. So when that's coupled, that kind of relationship style and the dysregulation is coupled with the abandonment fears we also see in narcissistic people, once again highlights the volatility that often arises for a person with a disorganized, fearful attachment style who is in a narcissistic relationship. Now, the struggle is that people with disorganized/fearful attachment styles do want relationships, but have such a difficult time with trust, are terribly afraid of rejection, and may get really invested in self-protection by not letting a partner to get close, but also experiencing despair and strong emotion when a partner wants to end a relationship. There's a constant tension for people with disorganized attachment styles because in this style, this attachment style means it's sort of you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop in a relationship. And there's a constant anticipation that the other person in the relationship is going to leave. So for a person with a disorganized attachment, it's almost like a constant wait for the inevitable abandonment that is coming. And this can also mean that a person with a disorganized attachment style may sort of preemptively end a relationship before the other person can end it first. In a narcissistic relationship, you can see how this style would fuel this volatility because for narcissistic folks, especially a narcissistic person with an anxious attachment, abandonment can result in rage and manipulation. And again, this perception of a partner as unpredictable or inconsistent is actually borne out if the disorganized attachment person is in a relationship with a narcissistic person. So the cycle of the narcissistic relationship that goes from idealization to devaluation is psychologically horrifying for a person with a disorganized and fearful attachment style. These relationship cycles of when you have a person with a disorganized attachment style who gets into a relationship with someone with a narcissistic personality style means that we see a roller coaster of highs and lows. And the trauma-bonded patterns in these relationships may be more intense. This intensity may actually keep a person with a disorganized attachment style hooked. It becomes a confirmation, sadly, that relationships are unsafe and untrustworthy, and that confirmation can keep a person locked into a toxic cycle. The disorganized attachment style is often born out of a history of childhood abuse. A child either being a direct recipient of abuse or the child witnessing a caregiver being abused. Whatever that sort of the trauma and the chaos the child grew up with, it sets up a cycle of fearful attachments from a childhood with a child never knowing how to get their needs met or not knowing if their needs ever will be met. From a survival standpoint, the child is stuck in a constant state of fear and insecurity. And despite that natural drive to want to trust, the attempts to trust are often met with betrayal, and that leads to this attachment style. Now remember, there are two people in a relationship, and it is also possible that the narcissistic person themselves, if they also have a disorganized attachment style, it would then be a relationship with two fearfully disorganized attached persons in it, and one of them's narcissistic. And this is very much an environment of volatility, distrust, fear, abandonment, and major difficulties with ever being able to create any kind of consistent, intimate, and deep bond between partners. For people with disorganized attachments, because trauma is so often part of the origin of the disorganized attachment style, trauma-informed therapy is often essential to work on these issues. None of these attachment styles are an indictment. You're not stuck forever. But all of the attachment styles, the disorganized attachment style in a narcissistic relationship probably has the worst outcomes and may experience some of the worst fallout from narcissistic abuse. The disorganized attachment style, again, that early history of how much loss and invalidation there was, that incapacity to feel that there's any safe places to go. It's a difficult attachment style to bear up under. So to have that attachment style and the kind of insecurity and lack of safety it creates in the world, and then to enter into a relationship with somebody who has marginal empathy, a need for dominance, and is willing to manipulate, that manipulation, when a person with a disorganized attachment style who's already living in so much fear and sometimes confusion in these relationships, that kind of manipulation can really, really create so much distress. So this is a tough combination. Again, trauma-informed therapy, if a person has this attachment style, is essential and can really make a difference. Here's the last one we're going to talk about, the secure attachment style. I don't want to say I saved the best for last because I think that feels judgy. Let's just call this the last in the series about attachment styles and how they affect us in narcissistic relationships. Certainly having the secure attachment style is probably the nicest attachment style to have, but I think our attachment styles are attachment styles, and to say one is the best, it seems, I don't know, that feels like a slippery slope. The secure attachment style, though, is the healthiest of the bunch. Folks with secure attachments feel safe in the world and in their relationships, feel safe expressing their needs and their emotions and aspirations in a relationship. People who are securely attached are comfortable with getting close and having deep, mutual, and reciprocal relationships. People who have secure attachments do fine with goodbyes, and they miss the people they care about and that they're close to when they're far away, but they don't feel panicky or struggle with feelings of abandonment when someone whom they care about goes away. People who are securely attached do quite well in relationships. They also do fine when they're not in relationships and tend to feel whole and complete within themselves and don't feel like they need a relationship to feel whole. Folks with secure attachments are typically able to regulate their emotions well in their relationships. And while the securely attached style is a very healthy style, it doesn't mean it's always rainbows and moonbeams just because you have a secure attachment. But if things aren't going well in the life of someone with a secure attachment, securely attached people will be able to express their needs in an appropriate manner, or at least to disengage. So what does the secure attachment style look like when this person gets pulled into a narcissistic relationship? You may make the erroneous assumption that, well, securely attached people are never going to get into a narcissistic relationship. That is simply untrue. People who are securely attached are also quite vulnerable to the charm, the charisma, the seductiveness, the love bombing that is the early phase of any adult onset narcissistic relationship. And in fact, the confidence, the self-regulation, and the sort of even-keeled nature of a securely attached person in a relationship may actually be appealing to a narcissistic person, at least for a little while, because by definition, a securely attached person is no drama. However, the good regulation and lack of abandonment fears that a securely attached person has may also kind of put a narcissistic person a little bit off. While they're not aware of it, narcissistic folks are definitely not immune to fears of abandonment. So they may actually experience the securely attached person's comfort with separation and time away as sort of uncomfortable and may lash out. It's like the securely attached person is too well put together. Once a securely attached person is in a narcissistic relationship, they may be a little less vulnerable to the classical patterns of trauma bonding. And as the more toxic patterns in these relationships show up, the securely attached person may attempt to communicate about them in an open and honest way and not be as afraid of abandonment. But if a securely attached person does fall in love with a narcissistic person, and that happens all the time, and they want the relationship to sustain, there may still be vulnerability to patterns such as justification, rationalization, giving the narcissistic person the benefit of the doubt. And if the securely attached person doesn't understand narcissism or the dynamics of these relationships, they may attempt to go deeper in these relationships and communicate clearly to the narcissist, and then have to face the narcissistic person's gaslighting and manipulation and invalidating and basic allergy to intimacy. A securely attached person who is less concerned, they're not going to be concerned about abandonment, may feel a little safer just ending the relationship if it's untenable and not working, and may be better equipped to manage the experience if a narcissistic person gets up and leaves them. However, a securely attached person may face the same crises as anyone in a narcissistic relationship. For example, the struggles that come if you're married to a narcissist and you have minor children, or if you have a toxic boss. And as a result, a securely attached person is certainly going to experience the stress, the psychological wear and tear, the distress, the confusion, and the frustration of a narcissistic relationship. They may be less likely to engage, securely attached people may be less likely to engage in self-blame, but will still be confused and may be invested in maintaining the narcissistic relationship for reasons such as family stability or financial necessity. And just because a person has a secure attachment style doesn't mean that a relationship like this will not throw them off and leave them feeling deeply uncomfortable, hurt, confused, and sort of completely thrown off their game. A secure attachment style is a gift when a narcissistic relationship ends. Whenever a narcissistic relationship ends, it's always going to be messy and awful and damaging to be in one of these relationships and then have to navigate the post-separation territory. But in my experience of working with securely attached people who have been in narcissistic relationships, their recovery and healing were a bit more linear. Still difficult, but because secondary to that secure attachment, they had the capacity to seek out other supports, seek out help such as therapy, and cultivate friendships and turn to other healthy spaces. Just as I have said before, while the classical narrative is that a person has a narcissistic parent or abusive parents, and then they replicate that cycle in adulthood, it's not always that simple. And many securely attached people from stable and safe and even happy families find themselves drawn into the charismatic vortex and may find themselves believing in the capacity of the narcissistic person to change. One thing to remember about attachment styles is that they are not destiny. Just because you have this attachment style, it doesn't mean you cannot enter into a healthy relationship in adulthood. Many people do, and many people have, and then can establish a secure attachment with a partner despite having an anxious attachment style, for example, from childhood. And it is also not beyond the pale for a person to have secure attachments from childhood and then get into a narcissistic relationship in adulthood and find themselves in a more anxiously attached relationship with that narcissistic partner. Now listen, early secure attachments are great for anyone in the long run. And from a probability perspective, secure attachments are going to predict better outcomes in life, especially in psychological and relationship life. But none of us are fully immune to the charm and the masks of the narcissistic person that can often draw us into something that's not good for us for a long time before we fully understand it, regardless of our attachment style. But that secure attachment style, that's a good thing. And it can make human relationships a rich and safe and rewarding space. But I'm going to toss a little hope your way. Even if you didn't develop secure attachments in childhood, you absolutely have the opportunity to develop them in adulthood. Just stay away from the narcissistic folks. Thanks again.